Hey guys, welcome back to Another World Audiobooks. I am so excited to be bringing you a brand new audiobook. This one is called Meet the Tiger. This is a book series that I'd actually never heard of before. So when I was trying to decide which book to do next, I was doing a ton of research. I had some suggestions from listeners that I was checking out, and I was trying to find something that really just aligned with some of the books that I enjoy reading. And as I've done all these public domain audiobooks, you go back to the early 1900s, late 1800s and stuff, you start to see patterns, and you see that books that were written way back then, they've inspired the authors that are writing today. And I know as an author myself, I've been inspired by authors who have come before, and so it just makes sense. You've got this chain of inspiration that goes back decades and decades and decades. It's so cool to see that. If you're interested in this topic at all, I would highly encourage you to look into this author. His name is Leslie Charteris. It's really cool. He actually, I found out that he wrote novels in this series of the Saint series for 55 years, which is one of the longest runs by a single author in mystery history, which is really cool. Additionally, he is also considered the godfather of the modern spy thriller, said to have influenced Ian Fleming, who created James Bond. Just all that stuff. The other really cool thing to note is that this book was written by him when he was about 20 years old. So he actually kind of restarted his series. So this is the first novel in the Saint series, but there's actually another one that was written a little bit later, and the author, Leslie Charteris, he thought that the first one was just not as polished as he wanted his series to be, so he considers the second book in the series to be kind of the real start of the series, but I couldn't help but start with the actual first novel, so we're going to start with this. We'll see if you guys enjoy it. We're definitely going to go ahead and move forward in this series at some point, doing how we do. We never stay in one series for a super long time. We're kind of bouncing all over the place, but hopefully you guys enjoy it, and I'm really excited to be bringing it to you. That being said, I am super grateful. This is a very made for serializing type of book. So these chapters are tight, they're exciting, they're awesome, but they're also a little bit on the shorter side, which, don't worry, it's allowing me to be doing on some stuff on the back end. So I'm working on this book. I'm also working on 2 other books at the same time, and there's also a 3rd book that I'm potentially going to be starting on here very shortly. So shorter chapters, but don't worry, that is going to mean a lot more content down the road. So please be patient with me, and thank you so much for your support of the podcast in this time as I'm trying to work on basically 4 different audiobooks all at the same time. So just wanted to let you know that, so you're not confused as to why we've got shorter episodes here. If you do want longer episodes, the best way to make sure that happens is to sign up to become a patron. So go over to patreon.com, and you can sign up there, or the best way is to go to anotherworldaudiobooks.com, and you can sign up. There is a link to get the Patreon perks. There's also a link in the show notes of each episode for Patreon as well. That is the best way to support the podcast. If you want to sign up, just a couple bucks a month. If we get all the listeners do it a couple bucks a month, that is going to help me a ton in being able to bring you guys longer episodes, more often episodes, all that good stuff. So check that out, anotherworldaudiobooks.com. I really appreciate all of our amazing patrons who make this podcast possible. Like I said, lots of extra content coming, but most of that is going to be for patrons. So if you want that extra content, that sweet extra content, make sure you sign up as a patron. Also, patrons have been getting episodes way crazy early. So for the last book, when we did the final couple chapters there of Lupin, they got the first half of the chapter early, and then they got the second half even earlier than everybody else. So that's a really great perk of becoming a patron, is you get episodes earlier, and that's a really good thing. So if you want to enjoy that, go check that out again on anotherworldaudiobooks.com. But if you can't support the podcast monetarily, I totally understand. I listen to lots of free podcasts that have Patreons all the time, so no blame there. However, the best way to support the podcast, if you can't sign up as a patron, is to go and just share the podcast, tell other people that you know about the podcast. It makes a huge difference, and I so appreciate it. Apologies for the long intro here. I just thought some of the background on this novel would be interesting for you, and to kind of give you a sneak peek on what's going on the back end of the podcast. So without further ado, let's jump into the first chapter of Meet the Tiger. Meet the Tiger. The first Saint novel. Written by Leslie Charteris. Narrated by Brady Smith. Chapter 1. The Pillbox. Baycombe is a village on the North Devon coast that is so isolated from civilization that even at the height of the summer holiday season it is neglected by the rush of lean and plump, tall and short papas and mammas and infants. Consequently, there was some sort of excuse for a man who had taken up his dwelling there falling into the monotony of regular habits, even for a man who had only lived there for 3 days. Even, let the worst be known, for a man so unconventional as Simon Templar. It was not so very long after Simon Templar had settled down in Baycombe that peacefully sedate village became most unsettled, and things began to happen there that shocked and flabbergasted its peacefully sedate inhabitants, as will be related. But at first, Simon Templar found Baycombe as dull as it had been for the last 600 years. Simon Templar. In some parts of the world he was quite well known, from his initials, as the Saint. A man of 27, tall, dark, keen-faced, deeply tanned, blue-eyed. That is a rough description. It was not long before Baycombe had observed him more closely, and woven mysterious legends about him. Baycombe did that within the first 2 days of his arrival, and it must be admitted that he had given some grounds for speculation. The house he lived in, it may perhaps be dignified with the title of house, since a gang of workmen from Ilfracombe had worked without rest for 36 hours to make it habitable, had been built during the war as a coast defence station, at a time when the War Office were vaguely alarmed by rumours of a projected invasion at some unlikely point. Possibly because they thought Baycombe was the last point any enemy strategist would expect them to expect an invasion at, the War Office had erected a kind of pillbox on the tor above the village. The work had been efficiently carried out, and a small garrison had been installed. But apparently the War Office had been cleverer than the German tacticians, for no attempt was made to land an army at Baycombe. In 1918, the garrison and the guns had been removed, and the miniature concrete fortress had been abandoned to the games of the local children, until Simon Templar, by some means known only to himself, had discovered that the pillbox and the quarter of a square mile of land in which it stood was still the property of the War Office, and in some secret way had managed to persuade the said War Office to sell him the freehold for £25. In this curious home the Saint had installed himself, together with a retainer who went by the name of Orris. And the Saint had been so overcome with the dullness of Baycombe that within 3 days he was the victim of routine. At 9 a.m. on this third day, the Saint had rooted objection to early rising. The man who went by the name of Orris entered his master's bedroom, bearing a cup of tea and mug of hot water. "Nice morning, sir," said Orris, and retired. Orris had remarked on the niceness of the morning for the last 8 years, and he had never allowed the weather to change his pleasant custom. The Saint yawned, stretched himself like a cat, and saw with half-closed eyes that a stream of sunlight was pouring in through the embrasure which did duty for a window. The optimism of Orris being justified, Simon Templar sighed, stretched himself again, and after a moment's indecision leapt out of bed. He shaved rapidly, sipping his tea in between whiles, and then pulled on a bathing costume and went out into the sun, picking up a length of rope on his way out. He skipped energetically on the grass outside for 15 minutes. Then he shadow-boxed for 5 minutes. Then he grabbed a towel, knotted it loosely round his neck, sprinted the couple of dozen yards that lay between the pillbox and the edge of the cliff, and coolly swung himself over the edge. 150-foot drop lay beneath him, but handholds were plentiful, and he descended to the beach as nonchalantly as he would have descended a flight of stairs. The water was rippling calm. He covered a quarter of a mile at racing speed, turned on his back, and paddled lazily shorewards, finishing the last 100 yards like a champion. Then he lay at the edge of the surf, basking in the strengthening sun. All these things he had done as regularly on the 2 previous mornings, and he was languidly pondering the deadliness of regular habits, when the thing happened that proved to him quite conclusively that regular habits could be more literally deadly than he had allowed for. Phew! Something sang past his ear, and the pebble at which he had been staring in an absent-minded sort of way leapt sideways, and was left with a silvery streak scored across it, while the thing that had sang changed its note and went whining seawards. "Bad luck, sonny," murmured the saint mildly. "Only a couple of inches out." But he was on his feet before the sound of the shot had reached him. He was on one of the arms of the bay, which was roughly semicircular. The village was in the center of the arc. A quick calculation told him that the bullet had come from some point on the cliff between the pillbox and the village, but he could see nothing on the skyline. A moment later, a frantic silhouette appeared at the top of the tor, and the voice of Oris hailed down an anxious query. The saint waved his towel in response, and, making for the foot of the cliff, began to climb up again. He accomplished the difficult ascent with no apparent effort, quite unperturbed by the thought that the unknown sniper might essay a second round. And presently the saint stood on the grass above, hands on hips, gazing keenly down the slope towards the spot where the bullet had seemed to come from. A quarter of a mile away was a broad clump of low bushes. Beyond the copse, he knew, was a cart track leading down to the village. The saint shrugged and turned to Oris, who had been fuming and fidgeting around him. "The tiger knows his stuff," remarked Simon Templar, with a kind of admiration.
"Like a greenhorn?"
spluttered Oris.
"Like an amateur? What did you expect? And just what you observed, and I hope it learns her. You ain't hurt, sir, are you?"
added Oris, succumbing to human sympathy. "No, but near enough," said the saint. Oris flung out his arms.
"Pity he didn't plug you one, just to make you more careful next time. I'd have been grateful to him, and if I ever lay my hands on the swine, it's for it,"
concluded Oris, somewhat illogically, and strutted back to the pillbox. Oris, as a sergeant of marines, had received a German bullet in his right hip at Zeebrugge, and had walked with the lopsided strut ever since.
"Breakfast in half a minute,"
Oris flung over his shoulder. The saint strolled after him at a leisurely pace, and returned to his bedroom whistling. Nevertheless, Oris, entering the sitting-room with a tray precisely half a minute later, found the saint stretched out in an armchair. The saint's hair was impeccably brushed, and he was fully dressed, according to the saint's idea of full dress, in shoes, socks, a dilapidated pair of grey flannel trousers, and a snowy silk tennis shirt. Oris snorted, and the saint smiled. "Oris," said the saint conversationally, lifting the cover from a plate of bacon and eggs, "one gathers that things are just about to hum." Responded Oris. "About to if you prefer it," said the saint equably. "The point is that the orchestra are in their places. The noises off have hitched up their hosiery, the conductor has unkempt his hair, the seconds are getting out of the ring, the guard is blowing his whistle, the skipper has rung down for full steam ahead, the
coffee's getting cold,"
said Oris. The saint buttered a triangle of toast. "How unsympathetic you are, Oris," he complained. "Well, if my flights of metaphor fail to impress you, let us put it like this. We're off." Agreed Oris, and returned to the improvised kitchen. Simon finished his meal, and returned to the armchair from which he had a view of the cliff and the sea beyond. He skimmed through the previous day's paper. Baycombe was at least 24 hours behind the rest of England, and then smoked a meditative cigarette. At length he rose, fetched and pulled on a well-worn tweed coat, picked up an unwieldy walking stick, and went to the curtained breach in the fortifications, which was used for a front door. "Oris!"
"Sir?"
answered Oris, appearing at the threshold of the kitchen. "I'm going to have a look around. I'll be back for lunch."
"Aye, aye, sir. Sir!"
The saint was turning away, and he stopped. Oris fumbled under his apron and produced a fearsome weapon, a revolver of pre-war make and enormous caliber, which he offered to his master.
"It ain't much to look at,"
said Oris, stroking the barrel lovingly.
"And I wouldn't use her for fancy shooting, but it'll make a bigger hole in a man than any of those pretty automatics."
"Thanks," grinned the saint, "but it makes too much noise. I prefer Anna." Said Oris. Oris could put any shade of meaning into that simple monosyllable, and on this occasion there was no doubt about the precise shade of meaning he intended to convey. The saint was studying a slim blade which he had taken from a sheath strapped to his forearm, hidden under his sleeve. The knife was about 6 inches long in the blade, which was leaf-shaped and slightly curved. The haft was scarcely 3 inches long, but beautifully carved ivory. The whole was so perfectly balanced that it seemed to take life from the hand that held it, and its edge was so keen that a man could have shaved with it. The saint spun the sliver of steel high in the air, and caught it adroitly by the hilt as it fell back, and in the same movement he returned it to its sheath, with such speed that the knife seemed to vanish even as he touched it. "Don't you be rude about Anna," said the saint, wagging a reproving forefinger. "She's taken a man's thumb off before the gun was half out of his pocket." And he went striding down the hill towards the village, leaving Oris to pessimistic disgust. It was early summer and pleasantly warm, a fact which made the saint's selection of the Pillbox for a home less absurd than it would have seemed in winter. There was another reason for his choice, besides a desire for quantities of fresh air and the simple life, as will be seen. The saint whistled as he walked, swinging his heavy stick, but his eyes never relaxed their vigilant study of every scrap of cover that might hide another sniper. He walked boldly down to the bushes which he had suspected that morning, and spent some time in a minute search for incriminating evidence. But there had been no rain for days, and even his practiced eye could make little of the spoor he found. Near the edge of the cliff, he caught a golden gleam under a tuft of grass, and found a cartridge case. "315 Mauser," commented the saint. "Naughty, naughty." He dropped the shell into his pocket and studied the ground closely, but the indistinct impressions gave him no clue to the size or shape of the unknown, and at last he resumed his thoughtful progress towards the village. Baycombe, which is really no more than a fishing village, lies barely above sea level, but on either side the red cliffs rise away from the harbour, and the hills rise behind, so that Baycombe lies in a hollow opening on the Bristol Channel. Facing seawards from the harbour, the Pillbox would have been seen crowning the Tor on the right, the only building to the east for some 10 miles. The Tor on the left was some 50 feet lower, and was dotted with half a dozen red brick and grey stone houses belonging to the aristocracy. The saint, via Oris, who had drunk beer in the public house by the quay to some advantage, already knew the names and habits of this oligarchy. The richest member was one Hans Blum, a boor of about 50, who was also reputed to be the meanest man in Devonshire. Blum frequently had a nephew staying with him, who was as popular as his uncle was unpopular. The nephew was Algernon de Britton Lomas Coper, wore a monocle, was one of the lads, and highly esteemed locally for a very pleasant chap. The best people were represented by Sir Michael Lapping, a retired judge, and proletariat by Sir John Bittle, a retired wholesale grocer. There was a manor, but it had no lord, for it had passed to a gaunt, grim, masculine lady, Miss Agatha Girton, who lived there, unhonoured and unloved, with her ward, whom the village honoured and loved without exception. For the rest, there were 2 Indian civil servants who, under the prosaic names of Smith and Shaw, survived on their pensions in a tiny bungalow. And a Dr. Khan. "A very dull and ordinary bunch," reflected Simon Templar, as he stood at the top of the village street, pondering his next move. "Except perhaps the ward. Is she the lovely heroine of this blinking adventure?" This hopeful thought directed his steps toward the Blue Moon, which was at the same time Baycombe's club and pub. But the saint did not reach the Blue Moon that morning, because as he passed the shop which supplied all the village requirements, from shoes to ships and sealing wax, a girl came out. "I'm very sorry," said the saint, steadying her with one arm. He retrieved the parcel which the collision had knocked out of her hand, and in returning it to her he had the chance of observing her face more closely. He could find no flaw there, and she had the most delightful of smiles. Her head barely topped his shoulder. "You must be the ward," said Simon. "Miss Pat. The village doesn't give you a surname." She nodded.
"Patricia Home," she said. "And you must be the mystery man."
"Not really? Am I that already?" said the saint with interest, and she saw at once that the desire to hide his light under a bushel was not one of his failings. It is always a question whether the man inspires the nickname or the nickname inspires the man. When a man is known to his familiars as Beau or rabbit, there is little difficulty in supplying the answer, but a man who is called saint may be either a lion or a lamb. It is doubtful whether Simon Templar would have been as proud of his title as he was if he had not found that it provided him with a ready-made, effective, and useful pose, for the saint was pleasantly egotistical.
"There are the most weird and wonderful rumours,"
said the girl, and the saint looked milder than ever. "You must tell me," he said. He had fallen into step beside her, and they were walking up the rough road that led to the houses on the west tor.
"I'm afraid we've been very inhospitable," she said frankly. "You see, you set up your house in the Pillbox, and that left everybody wondering whether you were possible or impossible. Baycombe society is awfully exclusive."
"I'm flattered," said the saint. "Accordingly, after seeing your home, I shall return to the Pillbox and sit down to consider whether Baycombe society is possible or impossible." She laughed.
"You're a most refreshing relief," she told him. "Baycombe is full of inferiority complexes."
"Fortunately," remarked Simon gently, "I don't wear hats." Presently she said,
"What brings you to this benighted spot?"
"A craving for excitement and adventure," answered the saint promptly, reinforced by an ambition to be horribly wealthy. She looked at him with a quick frown, but his face confirmed the innocence of sarcasm which had given a surprising twist to his words.
"I shouldn't have thought anyone would have come here for that," she said.
"On the contrary," said the saint genially, "I should have no hesitation in recommending this particular spot to any qualified adventurer as one of the few places left in England where battle, murder, and sudden death may be quite commonplace events."
"I have lived here on and off since I was 12, and the most exciting thing I can remember is a house on fire,"
she argued, still possessed of an uneasy feeling that he was making fun of her. "Then you'll really appreciate the rough stuff when it does begin," murmured Simon cheerfully, and swung his stick, whistling. They reached the manor. It was not an imposing building, but it had a homely air, and the girl held out her hand.
"Won't you come in?"
The saint was no laggard. "I'd love to." She took him into a sombre but airy drawing-room, finely furnished, but the saint was never self-conscious. The contrast of his rough, serviceable clothes with the delicate brocade upholstery did not impress him, and he accepted a seat without any appearance of doubting its ability to support his weight.
"May I fetch my aunt?"
asked Miss Home.
"I know she'd like to meet you."
"But of course," assented the saint, smiling, and she was left with a sneaking suspicion that he was agreeing with her second sentence as much as with her first. Miss Girton arrived in a few moments, and Simon knew at once that Baycombe had not exaggerated her grimness. "Honora," Horace had reported, and the saint felt inclined to agree. Miss Girton was stocky and as broad as a man. He was surprised at the strength of her grip when she shook hands with him. Her face was weather-beaten. She wore a shirt and a tie and a coarse tweed skirt, woolen stockings, and heavy flat-heeled shoes. Her hair was cropped.
"I was wondering when I should meet you," she said immediately. "You must come to dinner and meet some people. I'm afraid the company's very limited here."
"I'm afraid I'm prepared for very little company," said Templar. "I'd decided to forget dress clothes for a while."
"Lunch, then. Would you like to stay today?"
"May I be excused? Don't think me uncivil, but I promised my man I'd be back for lunch. If I don't turn up," explained the saint ingeniously, "Horace would think something had happened to me, and he'd go cruising round with his revolver, and somebody might get hurt." There was an awkward hiatus in the conversation at that point, but it was confined to two of the party, for Templar was admiring a fine specimen of Venetian glass, and did not seem to realize that he had said anything unusual. The girl hastened into the breach.
"Mr. Templar has come here for adventure,"
she said, and Miss Girton stared.
"Well, I wish him luck," she said shortly. "On Friday, then, Mr. Templar. I'll ask some people."
"Delighted," murmured the saint, bowing, and now there was something faintly mocking about his smile. "On the whole, I don't see why the social amenities shouldn't be observed, even in a vendetta." Miss Girton excused herself soon after, and the saint smoked a cigarette and chatted lightly and easily with Patricia Home. He was an entertaining talker, and he did not introduce any more dark and horrific allusions into his remarks. Nevertheless, he caught the girl looking at him from time to time with a kind of mixture of perplexity, apprehension, and interest, and was hugely delighted. At last he rose to go, and she accompanied him to the gate.
"You seem quite sane,"
she said bluntly as they went down the path.
"What was the idea of talking all that rot?"
He looked down at her, his eyes dancing. "All my life," he replied, "I have told the truth. It is a great advantage, because if you do that, nobody ever takes you seriously."
"But talking about murders and revolvers?"
"Perhaps," said the saint with that mocking smile, "it will increase the prominence of the part which I hope to play in your thoughts from now onwards, if I tell you that, from this morning, the most strenuous efforts will be made to kill me. On the other hand, of course, I shall not be killed, so you mustn't worry too much about me. I mean, don't go off your feet or lie awake all night or anything like that."
"I'll try not to,"
she said lightly. "You don't believe me?" accused Templar sternly. She hesitated.
"Well,
one day," said the saint severely, "you will apologize for your unbelief." He gave her a stiff bow and marched away so abruptly that she gasped. It was exactly 1 o'clock when he arrived home at the Pillbox, and Oris was flustered and disapproving.
"If you hadn't been home punctual," said Oris, "I'd been out looking for your corpse. It ain't fair to give a man such a lot of worry. You're so careless, I wonder the tiger ain't punched you out 6 times.
"I've met the most wonderful girl in the world," said Simon impenitently. "By all the laws of adventure, I'm bound to have to save her life 2 or 3 times during the next 10 days. I shall kiss her very passionately in the next chapter. We shall be married—" Oris snorted.
"Luncheon have a minute,"
he said, and disappeared. The saint washed his hands and ran a comb through his hair in the half-minute's grace allowed him, and the saint was thoughtful. He had his full measure of human vanity, and it tickled his sense of humour to enter the lists with the air of a mystery man straight out of a detective story, but he had a solid reason for giving his caprice its head. It struck him that the tiger knew all about him and his quest, and that therefore no useful purpose would be served by trying to pretend innocence. Whereas a shameless bravado might well bother the other side considerably. They would be racking their brains to find some reason for his brazen front, and crediting him with the most complicated subtleties, when, all the time, there was nothing behind it but the fact that one pose was as good as another, and the opportunity to play the swashbuckler was too good to be missed. The saint was whistling blithely when Oris brought lunch. He knew that the tiger was in Baycombe. He had come halfway across the world to rob the tiger of $1 million, and the duel promised to be as exhilarating as anything in the saint's hell-for-leather past. I don't know about you guys, but I'm really excited about this novel. I'm already starting on the 2nd chapter, and it is a lot of fun. This novel just really gets going, and it does not slow down. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. Make sure, if you want to get these episodes early, you sign up as a patron. And if you want to get some of that extra content that's going to be coming down the pike here very soon, that you also sign up as a patron. Again, that's anotherworldaudiobooks.com. You can sign up right there. There's several different levels, different tiers that you can sign up on and get episodes early and get extra content and all sorts of awesome stuff. Make sure to check that out. But if you can't do that, no worries. Just share the podcast. Tell somebody that you know about the best podcast that you love listening to that has all these free audiobooks, hundreds and hundreds of episodes, and hundreds of hours of content for you to enjoy and to share. Thanks, guys, for listening, and we'll catch you next week.